Let's talk a little bit about attribute mapping. Probably one of the longest videos that you can click on in this UI, because it's a bit of a complex, or can be a bit of a complex topic. Especially one thing I want to achieve here is to show you around through attribute mapping so that you get an idea what you can achieve there, and you probably see the simple use cases straight away. However, I also want to give you an idea of the power that lies within attribute mapping and transformation, so that you hopefully get in touch with us via support ticket or via screen share session, so that we can help you solve any more complex tasks that you might have, so that you get an idea, yeah, that actually could work with attribute mapping. So attribute mapping as such is, what I mean with that is you have some attributes, or you have some values coming in the SAML response from the identity provider. Yeah, at the minimum that's the name ID, which is the default value for username. But a lot of identity providers send additional attributes like full name, some group memberships, and usually you can configure that list on the identity provider to be even bigger on what the identity provider sends in the SAML response. Yeah? And on the other side, you have fields in Jira, Confluence, your Atlassian application. And attribute mapping is about taking the values that come in via the SAML response and mapping them to certain fields to be used in Jira. So the minimum to do a login, that's with the username. Yeah, so we need to map in which attribute is the username being sent, and what do we use, or what do we use as a lookup for the Jira username. And there's a lot of default settings and default mappings that we have there. So with a lot of identity providers, the common ones, a lot of these things will work out of the box without you having to modify something. Yeah? However, it's very powerful if you can, and especially if you have some larger use cases. So let's have a quick look at the UI. The first thing that you can configure under attribute mapping is the find user by this Jira attribute, or Confluence if you're in Confluence, for example. That means you can determine which field in Jira, or the other Atlassian applications, our plugin should use to search for the user. So the default is to use the username field in Jira. Yeah? But especially if you have a historic setup, you might actually prefer to not look the user up via its username, because that might be all over the place. You might want to use the email address to do a lookup, and it certainly depends a little bit what's being sent as the username from the identity provider. Yeah? So if your identity provider sends the email address and that doesn't match what you historically create as a username in Jira, then doing the lookup via the email address would be a good thing. Some of our customers create a custom attribute, essentially an external ID, which they use to do the lookup, because that is the only unique attribute that they have in their identity provider and authentication architecture. Just that you know that's possible. Again, if you have a complex use case, then contact us and we are more than happy to help you with that. And if you have update from SAML attributes, or which is our just-in-time provisioning, or the combined user sync and SAML attributes selected here. So if you use any one of the provisioning methods that uses the SAML response attributes together with it, you will get this additional mapping table, where you see, for example, at the moment, name ID is mapped to the username, and that is the default. So the default is a SAML IDP will send the username as an attribute called name ID, and we try to find that user based on the username in Jira. And this mapping is then also used to create an update user if you configure our plugin to do the provisioning. You can, just to show that a little bit, you can edit that. And you can actually see there's a lot of templates already pre-populated here. So the default template is name ID, but you also have something like name ID and strip the email domain, or name ID and convert Azure guest users to a nicely looking email address. So there's a lot of templates that you can choose from already, and they are relatively specific to the IDP that you have chosen in the wizard to do the configuration. So the example I'm showing here is Azure AD. So this list will look slightly different for Okta or ADFS, for example. So, and very often, if you need something, you're well served with the default templates. Yeah? You can always also choose custom here, and then you have a lot more options. So you can populate it from a single response, from a single attribute in the SAML response from Azure AD. But you can also create a list of attributes. For example, if you have something like a SAM account name, so your on-prem or the account name from Active Directory, if that's not populated in Azure AD for every user, you can use that as a default username. But if that's empty, you can define a second attribute, for example, the Azure UPN, to be used as the username instead. You can also combine attributes and a constant value. And last but not least, there's also something really, really powerful, which is Groovy code. Yeah? So you can actually write some Groovy code, and we have, I'm going to quickly show you that. We also have some already examples in our knowledge base for transformations with Groovy. So you can do incredible stuff there. So for example, if there's an attribute with a role being sent, you can use that, match it, and then assign users to certain groups based on a role administrator, for example, that your IDP sends. So that gives that Groovy code gives a lot of flexibility. Essentially, you can write Java code that looks at what the IDP has sent and use that to then define or change that attribute, like the username, or later on groups, for example. Again, this is not something, if you do that for the first time, that I would absolutely expect you to easily solve, unless one of the examples really matches your case. Really reach out to us and talk to us if you have that requirement. But it is incredibly powerful. So there's also something in between. So if I have the name ID here and map that to the name ID attribute, there's still a little bit of simple stuff I can do here. For example, I can convert it to lowercase. I can apply regular expressions. So if you know what regular expressions are, they are essentially search and replace on steroids. So you don't always have to touch or write Groovy code to do some simple changes to it. Or for example, on the group side, it's relative. Sometimes IDPs send a comma-separated value instead of a multi-value list to split the attribute for group memberships, for example. From a comma-separated list to a multi-value attribute. That's something you can do in the UI here already. And you might see us doing that in some of the IDPs in their step-by-step guides where we describe that. So that's not as powerful as what you can do with Groovy code, but maybe a little bit more simple for simpler use cases. So all of that is actually something you can do. I'll show you something else, which is what you can also do, and is relatively popular. It's you can create a new attribute mapping, and let's create a user property attribute there, and I'm just going to call that phone, for example. Yeah. So if I have configured my IDP to send the phone number in a SAML response in an attribute, I can now map that. And on Azure, if I send that, that will look something like this very often. Apply it, and then I map the attribute. If I would be on Okta, for example, then this would be more as a normal text. I might have called it phone. So it's important to have the same configuration both on the IDP side and here. But this way, you can actually start mapping more information coming from your IDP to be added to the user's profile. In this case, those user property values, as an admin, you can see them in the user profile. Other users can't see that as them of each other. However, it's stored as a user property, so you can use it in things like script runner, for example, or in automations, in some other plugins to map custom fields, for example, can access user property fields. So this is, for example, very often used for Jira Service Desk or Jira tickets to map more user information into the ticket via custom fields, functions, or scripts that are running. But again, the main point is I want you to know that is fundamentally possible. And if you have that kind of use case, have a screen share with us, raise a support ticket, and we're more than happy to help you. To give you a last bit of outlook, in one of the very next versions, we will also be integrating with some third-party add-ons that extend the user profile in Confluence and Jira, so that we can write that information sent from the IDP into these other plugins, so that you can see them in the extended user profile or their social profile, etc. So I hope you found this useful. Sorry that was that long, but yeah, enjoy it. Thanks.